Okay. Uh, all right. So first of all, we were just wondering, how long have you worked at the BBC?
So it's coming up to, actually no, it's just past 5 years now. So I got in on an apprenticeship in 2016, and then so I've been working there for just over 5 years. It's a bit mental.
Yeah.
What kind of journalism do you specialise in?
So I work in podcasting. So that's kind of my day job. So I work on a product called Newscast, where we talk about the big news stories of the day, really.
Oh.
And that's kind of where I guess at the moment where my speciality is more in audio and long form audio as well. But I also kind of do a little bit of journalism outside of my day job. So I do a little bit of original journalism as well. And I kind of specialise a lot in mental health, stories about mental health, and specifically about CAMS, children and adolescent mental health services. So that's kind of my side project, should I say, my passion outside of my day job.
Yeah. Okay. And what does grief mean to you?
So it's obviously something that I'm very passionate about, because it's something that I have had to go through firsthand. So when I was on my college course, which obviously Natalie was one of my tutors, hence why we're speaking right now. So that was around the time I was in my last year of a course at Central Bedfordshire College, and unfortunately my younger brother, who was 16 at the time, passed away. So obviously I have my own personal experience of grief and understanding of how the impact that it has on especially younger people, but just anyone of any age, really. It can happen to, it can happen to you at any point in your life. And I think as well, when you lose someone that's very close to you, such as a parent or a sibling or a child even, it has a massive impact on you for the rest of your life. It's something that you kind of have to carry with you, throughout different stages in your life as well. And for me anyway, it's something that I'm very passionate about, because I know that when I first lost my brother, sorry, there's a bit of noise in the background. Give me 2 seconds. I'll go back to the previous point.
Yeah.
So I think for me, I'm obviously very passionate about it, because not just because of my personal experience, but I know how difficult it can be to actually come forward and talk about it, because there still is a bit of a taboo about grief and about death. So I try to do a lot of stories, or try to do as many stories as possible about grief in my kind of day job, to try and get people talking about it, but opening up the conversation, so that, especially in the last year, because it's been obviously, 2020, a lot of people would have lost someone due to COVID. I think it's really important to get people talking about it and opening up. So,
yeah.
What are your experiences with grief?
So losing my brother in 2013. So that obviously was my first big experience of grief. I had previously lost other family members. I'd lost grandparents, but I think it's a different experience, really, because you don't expect someone so young to die so soon. And I think that kind of rocks you in so many ways, because actually when you lose someone who's very young, it almost, I guess you have this idea of what life is and what life's about, and you expect that people will get to a certain age, and then although death is inevitable, you don't expect young people to die. You don't expect to have to go through that at such a young age. And my brother was only 16, I was only 19 when I lost my brother. So for me, and I think for a lot of young people who lose someone, it rocks your understanding of life. It almost feels as though I guess not that life is a lie or something along those lines, but I guess it makes you question things that you've believed for some time. And we always have that idea that, old people die, basically. I think when you're younger, you think you're invincible and you think that nothing's going to happen to you. And actually, when you go through that experience at a young age, you realize that life is actually really fragile, and this stuff can happen at any point in your life. And I think that's why it's so important to talk about it, because inevitably at some point you will lose someone, whether that's a grandparent, whether that's a friend, whether that's a sibling. You hope that happens much later on in your life, but if it does happen, there needs to be that support there, and people need to be able to talk about it in a way that allows them to express their grief without feeling guilt or sadness about doing that. I think it's really important.
Okay. From our research, we found out that there are five usual stages of grief, with them being denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Did you know of these, and do you feel like you've experienced any of these?
Yeah, I do. And if I'm honest with you, I don't necessarily, obviously there's science behind it, there's some kind of psychology, but actually I do question the 5 stages of grief, because I don't necessarily feel that grief is a linear process. It's not a straightforward road. And I think that there are lots of different elements, and basically, I think depending on how you lost someone, what age they were, what relationship you had to that person, there is all these different factors that come into play when you lose someone and when you're grieving. And I think it's not as simple as saying, okay, this is what you're going to go through at this stage, and this is how you're going to feel at that stage. I know from personal experience and through knowing people that have been through quite a big loss, you can feel these emotions at any stage in your life, because one, there's something called delayed grief. So at the time, if you weren't able to maybe express your grief in a way that meant that you could get out those emotions, or maybe you were in some way not able to talk to other family members, or not able to talk to friends who'd been through similar experiences, that grief might be suppressed for some time. So you could find that, 8-9 years down the road, you're actually going through the proper grieving process because you didn't go through it very early on. But also there's different stages of your life. For example, I know that when I graduated from the BBC, I felt, although I was really happy, there was also an element of guilt to it, because I guess it makes you realize your life is in essence moving on after going through something that you never thought you'd be able to move on from.
Yeah.
And it's not as though you don't ever get over it, don't get me wrong, I don't think you ever really truly get over something like that, and I don't think you want to, because it's such a big part of your life. I know personally I have to kind of carry on and almost in a way live my life not just for myself but for my brother as well, and in his memory. So actually I carry it with me, and I wouldn't ever want to just get over it, because it's a big part of who I am. And I've met a lot of friends as well through grief, through grief support groups and through talking about my situation online. So for me personally, I just don't know whether that 5 stages of grief can apply to every single situation. Sometimes when you look at maybe situations where someone's lost a grandparent, or situations where someone's lost a pet, or those types of grief that maybe you were not expecting, but I guess there comes a stage, a grandparent gets to a certain age and it's like, okay, well, unfortunately, this is kind of an inevitable part of life. I guess maybe that you probably would have. I know when my granddad died when I was 13, I probably had a lot more of a typical reaction or a typical grief. Not that there is a typical grief, I don't think, but I maybe had more of the 5 stages of grief than I did with my brother, which for me was all over the place. You find that a year later you might be feeling one thing that you should have been feeling last year, or you should have been feeling do you know what I mean? There's these constant kind of feelings of not really knowing how you're going to feel from 1 month to the next, especially early on in grief. So yeah, for me personally, not I'm sure, as I say, there's a lot of science behind it and a lot of psychology, and I think for some relationships it probably does apply, but there is so many complexities. And if you lose your relative to suicide. Obviously, that brings its own complications that losing a relative to cancer might not bring, or, you know, anticipatory grief, you know, if you know that that person's going to die before they die, that's going to bring a completely different emotion to, say, if your relative dies completely unexpectedly. So yeah, for me, I think it's about the circumstances and how your relationship is with that person that's died, and that will depend on how you react to it, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what stage do you feel was most difficult?
Or is most difficult?
I think for me, it's probably towards the end of that cycle. Because wait a minute, let me just shall I just get them up quickly so I can just have a quick look? Because I'm trying to think about which one would be best to talk about. Yeah, because I'm very I'm not anti it, but I'm just a bit, as I say, sometimes it's just difficult to put it all into one description, if you get what I mean. So I think probably the anger and the denial is the most difficult part, because when you're very early on in your grief, there is an element of it almost feeling as though it's not real. And I think as well, the interesting thing about like the stages of grief is that I feel like sometimes people think that they can happen within a certain period of time as well. So it's like, okay, I'm going to feel like this 1 month or one day, and then I'm going to feel like this the next day. And actually, this can be a period of time that goes on for many, many years. Or like you react to that grief over a long, long period of time. But I think the denial and the anger is probably, for me, the first year or two when you lose someone, is that feeling of not really knowing why it's happened to you. And I think part of you thinks, okay, this hasn't happened, this isn't real. You know, this can't be happening to me. And then another part of you is obviously angry because you're thinking, well, why? Why has this happened? Why has this happened to our family? But then again, why does it happen to anyone? So I think that's probably the most difficult part, because it's something that you can't really do much with. You can't do much with those emotions. Do you know what I mean? When you're angry, you just want to destroy things. You want to kind of let that anger out and express that, but it's very difficult, I think, to express those emotions. Whereas, it might be easier to express more traditional, Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. Was there anything that you found that helped you grieve at all?
Yeah, for me personally, it's really important to speak to other people that have been through something similar. I think it's really important to connect with people, because my personal experience, I started speaking to people very early on in my grief on Facebook groups and through social media. And I found that really helpful. And then sort of later on in my grief process, or my journey with grief, should I say, which, as you know, doesn't have a time limit. I think you kind of go through for the rest of your life. But I started going to actual support groups. So I went to like a retreat, which is specifically for people that had been bereaved of a sibling. And I met a lot of friends through that process. And it was really nice to just be in a room full of people who understood what you were going through, and you don't have to explain yourself. I feel like when you've been through grief and you've been through a loss, it's really difficult to explain it to people that don't understand.
Yeah.
And it's not, you don't obviously want them, in essence, you don't want them to understand, because you don't want anyone to have to go through what you've been through. But at the same time, you want to be able to connect with people who, as I say, you don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to say, this is why I'm feeling sad, or this is why I'm crying. You know, I feel like sometimes if you cry in front of people, people say, oh, why are you crying? You know, what they don't really understand exactly what you're going through at that time. So that is like the best advice that I could give anyone who's going through something similar, is reach out to, you know, charities. There's like the Compassionate Friends, there's Let's Talk About Loss, there's groups that are specifically aimed at younger people, where I feel like there's a bit of a gap in the market, not a gap in the market, but you know what I mean, like there's this gap in services where there hasn't previously been as much support for people under like 35 when it comes to grief. A lot of the resources are aimed at maybe older people, and so, or even children, you know, children and older people, but then there's this massive gap in between where, you know, teenagers, adolescents, where there is not that support network. And I feel like when you are going through that, the best thing you can do is befriend people and make connections with people who have been through similar experiences, because actually it completely changes your outlook. And I think it allows you to be able to express yourself around people who understand. And for me anyway, it's been really, really valuable. So yeah, definitely reach out to people that have been through the same thing.
Is there any support you wish you had when you were grieving?
I think it's slightly different depending on the way in which you've lost someone. So for example, my brother's death was very unexpected and he died in a hospital. And I feel like sometimes when a death like that happens, you don't necessarily have the support network there, because obviously you don't know it's going to happen. I know people that have lost relatives who had maybe life-limiting illnesses or the cancer, and sometimes it's great in the sense that I guess the hospice or those charities actually can offer that support. So in the build up to someone passing away, there's a lot of support there. But when you lose your relative unexpectedly, there isn't necessarily that level of support. And I had to go out of my way to kind of find that. Whereas now I feel like it makes it a bit easier for you to get that help, because one, there's lots more resources, but two, you know, if you put something out online saying I'm really struggling with my grief or I'm really struggling with my mental health, a lot of these charities or a lot of people in this community will actually reach out and say, hey, you know I do it. If I see someone who's recently lost a sibling online, I reach out to them and I say, have you heard about the Compassionate Friends? Have you heard about Let's Talk About Loss? And I feel as though because we talk more openly about grief now, there's a lot more resources. You think about Griefcast, the podcast, which is like one of the biggest podcasts out there in the UK, talking about death and grief, which you never would have expected because it was such a taboo subject, especially, you know, when I lost my brother, there was hardly anything out there about it. So actually, I wish that I had the same level of, or I wish that grief had been more openly spoken about when I lost my brother, because I think it would have made it easier.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like, in hindsight, do you know what I mean? Like, we can say all this stuff now, but actually it is what it is. And I'm just glad that now younger people have all that support and resource that they can go to if they need it. So that's great.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's anything we haven't asked which you believe is important when talking about grief?
No, I don't think so. I do think it's really important that when we talk about those stages of grief, we understand that they're not necessarily going to be set in stone. It's not necessarily going to be, this is what's going to happen at this stage, this is what's going to happen at that stage. I think you do go through all those emotions. You do go through the denial, as I say, when early on when it happens, that's kind of the first few months, but that can be up to a year where you're in denial that it's happened. A lot of people go into shock and just almost don't come to terms with it in the first year. It's like it didn't happen. And then the anger, I would say, the first 2 years, you definitely feel that. Bargaining, I mean, that is kind of, I guess, again, something that might happen in the early stages of grief, but the depression and acceptance is something that could happen. Sorry, why is my dog have to start barking at such an awkward time? He's not going to stop for ages now. Oh, that's why he's barking. I'll give him 2 seconds. Sorry, someone at the door. That's why.
It's okay.
Don't want to ruin your recording.
It's all good.
Okay, I think I can talk now. So the depression and acceptance, I think that can happen at any stage. And I feel like, I guess you do in essence accept it's happened, but acceptance in terms of actually, can I accept my life has changed forever and there'll be certain elements of my life. I know that, there are certain kind of, I guess, milestones in your life that I may struggle again with my grief, and I may almost go through that process again, or certain emotions which are part of those stages of grief. And so I think it's really important to remember that people don't just get over grief. It's not something that is like, okay, 5 years down the line, you're going to be absolutely fine now. This is something that a process people go through for the rest of their lives, especially if you've lost as I say, a sibling, a parent, a child before their time, or before you would expect maybe that to happen. I think that is something that you carry with you for the rest of your life, and something that has a lasting impact. So for me anyway, I think it's really important to remember that can happen at any stage, and it's not something that is just straightforward. This is what you're going to feel at this point, and you shouldn't feel bad for feeling those emotions at a different period of time. So
Cool. Oh, not cool, but in a sense,
interesting. Yeah. No, it is. I think it's super interesting. I think that there's so much information out there now that I didn't have when I lost my brother in 2013. And I think that actually, especially for younger people, there's Instagram pages, there's podcasts, there's documentaries. There's so much out there that just wasn't there 8 years ago. And I think it's really important that people feel that they can go and connect with other young people that are going through a similar loss, because it makes it less lonely. It's a really lonely experience when you go through such a massive grief. Why do I keep saying go through a massive grief? That's not even proper grammar. When you go through, cut that bit out. But when you go through such a big loss, it's so important that you are able to connect with other people and understand what they're going through, but what they can understand what you're going through.
Yeah. And
that allows you to feel less lonely in that experience, because I'll say grief is a really lonely experience to have to go through, especially any stage in your life, but I feel like younger people as well, because we don't really talk about it as much. It can be really difficult. So that's probably the best thing that I can say really, is that we just understand that there is help out there and resources, and that hopefully that will continue into the future, where at one point it will be so normal to talk about our grief and loss that you don't have to explain it and make it make sense. So
yeah. Right.